Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Michael Tremblay.
And I'm Caleb Ontiveros.
And today we are doing Musonius Rufus round 2. We're back to the teacher of Epictetus, one of the Stoic philosophers. We have a lot of his remaining writings. Interesting guys. We'll see moving forward. But we wanted to take this time to dig back into some of his thoughts. We did an earlier episode of Musonius Rufus. I've went through and reread all of his writings, or his remaining writings, or collections of his lessons and speeches, and back with some more summaries of insights or ideas that he shared. It's always useful to go back. We did that earlier episode, and I recommend anybody to go and listen to that as well. But we came out with some key themes that are really the most obvious ones that jump out when you read Musonius Rufus. These ideas of the emphasis on practice above theory. We talked about physical training and that importance that has for personal development, and his kind of egalitarianism, or his focus on this idea that women should study philosophy and should practice virtue. And I kind of went back through his writing with a challenge to see, well, can I push myself a little bit further? Does anything else new come out on a second reading? And I've come back with some other lessons or themes from his writing. Any other context you wanted to add before we jump into it?
Yeah, well, I think Musonius Rufus, if you think about the big three of Roman Stoicism, of course, it's Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca. But Musonius Rufus is certainly up there, and in part, perhaps just doesn't make that list because what we have from him are a shorter selection of discourses. And, that's it. If you imagine you only had a single book of Epictetus's discourses, perhaps we wouldn't rate Epictetus as highly, or perhaps we would, depending on the book. But we certainly don't have as much from him, but that doesn't mean he's not worth reading by any means. And he has several, I think, unique attributes that make him worth reading. And of course, he's a teacher of Epictetus, so it's good to see that thread in action.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's like if we had one or two chapters of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, you'd probably still see people talking about it, but when you have a larger body of writing, themes emerge more clearly. There's obviously more ideas being shared, so there's more goodness if the writing is good, but you get these reoccurring themes, these motifs, these ideas. And what we have from Musonius Rufus, if people are interested in reading him, we've got really 60 to 80 pages-ish, depending on the translation or edition you have, of recordings of his lessons, things that he taught or said, places that he was mentioned elsewhere. Like Epictetus mentions him because he was Epictetus's teacher and Epictetus's educator in Stoicism. But yeah, I don't think he's worse. There's just less writing there, and then maybe a bit less historical relevance compared to a Seneca or Marcus Aurelius, who people maybe read them. They come at those figures, and a Cicero, from a historical direction as well. They're just interested in what those famous people thought and said. But really enjoy his writing, and we'll get into this in a moment, but it's a good read for somebody who's already persuaded about Stoicism, somebody who's the practicing Stoic, I would say, because that's who it's written for. That's who it's intended for. It's written for his students. It's written for people that he's trying to teach. I keep saying written. These are recordings of lectures or speeches he's given, but he's giving it to students of Stoicism. There's not that many arguments in his writing for Stoic points. They're almost taken for granted, and then it's like, what's the implication of those? If those things are true, how do we practice them? How do we put them? How do we fit them into our lives? Is what he tends to focus on. And as we'll see in a moment, he's also really, I would say, stylistically unique because he provides very pragmatic or specific advice, advice about marriage or divorce or sexual intimacy, ways that you should act as a man or a woman. He gets very specific in a way that sometimes I feel the appeal to Stoicism is that it's very broad. And so if you learn something like The Dichotomy of Control by Epictetus, anybody could be like, oh, that's great. I'll take that. I'll add that to my toolkit. We've talked about this, Caleb, this almost like toolkit analogy. And Musonius Rufus doesn't, he's less about the toolkit. It's less about these philosophical insights that apply to anybody and more, this is specifically how you should live. And we'll get into some of those examples. And I think some of those are controversial because, if you disagree with Musonius Rufus, do you disagree with Stoicism or do you just disagree with Musonius Rufus? And that's fine because you'll almost certainly disagree with at least one of the things that he, recommends or says with just as much as conviction as he says that virtue is the only good. So with that, I'll jump into it unless there's anything else to add.
Oh, that sounds great.
Great. So as I said, I went through, we've hit on a bit, but who is Musonius? Just as a reminder, born in maybe 20 to 30 AD in central Italy, north of Rome, gained fame in Rome as a Stoic teacher, taught Epictetus, was eventually banished from Rome multiple times, actually, depending on who the emperor was and their relationship with philosophers, but taught people how to put Stoicism into practice. By this point, Stoicism had been a philosophical school for 300 years, one of quite some popularity. And so he provides these lectures or lessons on how to put Stoicism into practice. And so I've come up with 3 new themes from his lessons, 3 new themes about what he taught that I want to talk about. First one is philosophical minimalism. Second is what I'm going to call a complicated egalitarianism. And the third is this theme of just controversial practical advice that I was hitting on, really specific advice about how to live. So if we start with philosophical minimalism, we talked in our last conversation, Caleb, about how Musonius is focused on practice. He's focused on applying Stoicism. But when we talked about it last time, Musonius has this way of framing, first you learn the theory, then you put it into practice, right? It's this 2-step process, something that I see in the writings of Epictetus, but it comes from Musonius. But he also, more than that, more than saying, you shouldn't just be a bookworm, you shouldn't just study theory, that should be obvious to anyone listening. More than that, he's almost actually dismissive, or I would say philosophically minimalistic, or cautious about getting too into the arguments or too focused on the complexity of arguments or thinking that more is necessarily better. So one example is Musonius argues that it's better to be persuaded by a few strong arguments than many weak ones. It's better to be a philosopher who has a few really compelling arguments than, 1,000 is exaggeration, but 20, 30 reasons why virtue is the only good. And so here's a quote here. He says, "The teacher of philosophy should not seek to go through an abundance of words and arguments for those who are learning, but it should instead speak appropriately about each subject and reach the understanding of his listener and say things which he knows are persuasive and not easily overturned." So he's recommending that we have simple discussions that go straight to our understanding of the world. It's a very Socratic approach. He's like, when we're making arguments, they should appeal to the intuition of the listener. They should be common sense. They should use language that makes sense to people. And then once we've done those and we've made those simple, compelling arguments, the second point then shifts to practice. Then we need to act consistently. Has some other quotes here. "Only by exhibiting actions in harmony with sound words will anyone be helped by philosophy. And just as there is no use in medical study unless it leads to the health of the human body, so there is no use to philosophical doctrine unless it leads to the virtue of the human soul." So simple arguments that persuade people, persuade yourself, and then back those up with how you act. And one last piece here is this is the advice for the teacher, but it's also the same advice for the student. The student should also avoid overly complex theoretical debates. And I have a quote here. "Could someone acquire instant self-control by merely knowing that he must not be conquered by pleasure without training to resist them? Could someone become just by learning that he must love moderation but without practicing the avoidance of excess? Could someone acquire courage by realizing that things which seem terrible to most people are not to be feared, but without practicing being fearless towards them? So maybe that's not as much a point about complexity as much as it is that original point about we've really got to move out of the realm of the theoretical once we're persuaded, once we agree with the argument and get into the realm of practice. It's not enough to just know. You've got to act in accordance with it, as he says. So that's the philosophical minimalism, almost skeptical of an overtly academic approach to philosophy, I would say. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think sometimes people make this division between the Greeks and the Romans. Of course, seeing the Greeks as more theoretical, the Romans as less cerebral, more practical people. And you can almost I think that contrast might be useful here if you think about Musonius Rufus as the practical Roman looking to put philosophy into practice, as opposed to perhaps Chrysippus, who is writing works on logic and such. That's not to dismiss the Greeks by any means, but might be a useful mental model when coming at Musonius Rufus in particular. And you certainly get the sense that, philosophy is nothing more than noble action. Not through Musonius Rufus in each of his lectures. I think that's a key Stoic principle. It's not just something you get in Musonius Rufus, but it's something he certainly emphasizes clearly. So I think that's certainly true. You have philosophical minimal. So I suppose there are different aspects to philosophical minimalism, right? You have that focus on action, but the flip side to that, or sort of two additional points you're laying out, is a skepticism of, philosophy is perhaps not the right word, too much abstract reasoning, too much book knowledge, you might say. And I think you see this in Musonius Rufus's student, Epictetus, as well, who certainly respects the work of people like Chrysippus, but it scolds his students to, above all, focus on, showing philosophy not through the Chrysippus they've memorized, but through their actions, right? And Musonius Rufus hammers that point through as well. In addition, I think there's one of my favorite lectures by Musonius Rufus is, there's this point about, how you should teach philosophy using simple language, but I think there's also a really deep point about evidence and how you should reason in general, which is, people who are the best thinkers are able to be convinced by the smallest amount of evidence. So another way to put that is, you're thinking well if you can make the right decision again and again on the tiniest amounts of evidence. So I think sometimes maybe people think, good thinking means coming up with a list of 20 pros and cons, where in reality, of course, like the best thinker would be someone who's able to come to the right decision by recognizing the strongest argument and following through instead of, listening through 20 of them. Many thoughts, arguments that might be more red herrings or rabbit holes than anyone else. They're able to pick out what's important, focus on that, and then move on to the next thing. So I think there is something deep, I think, about the structure of reasoning and arguments there, in addition to this focus. And that's something novel, I think. I don't think you see that point, as far as I know, in other Stoics. Though certainly it's there implicitly, I think, and the focus on simplicity, being laconic in your speech. But it's not always spelled out like that. So I think that's pretty cool.
And to make it a bit less abstract, the exact part he's talking about, these Stoic arguments around good. I can't remember if it's an example of pleasure or wealth, but you say, well, you imagine he's talking to some student and he says, you say wealth is a good thing, but look at these people who come into inheritance, they win the lottery, and their life is filled with more trouble. People are coming after them for things. They get solitary because of their money. They get cynical or paranoid because of their money. These are inferences I make, but you see people make more money and they're not happier. and they don't have better lives because of it. And so therefore, money can't be a good. It sometimes harms. So it harms many people. It harms many people. You've seen that in your own life. And that's an example of a kind of conversation I could have with anybody. I could have that with any of my friends. I could have that with a stranger. And Musonius' point is like, that is a much better argument, because it gets right to the root of the matter, uses plain language. It speaks to people's intuitions, in a way that they don't need to be persuaded. They don't need to adopt this like complex alternative worldview. And so that kind of argument is a much better argument. And that to me is the kind of Socratic argument of, you're pulling out what people already think and you're showing the contradiction of what they already think. You tell me wealth is good, but you also tell me, your friend Jimmy has a lot of money and he's the most miserable person you know. So how do we resolve that conflict? It's that kind of Socratic strategy that he's really pointing to here as the best way to go about making arguments, which is a good reminder that we don't need to. I don't take my Greek terms from me. I still like being able to talk about, impressions and prohairesis and assent and things like these. But, those are only valuable insofar as I think you can ground them in, specific things that make sense to people that don't require them to adopt this entirely alternative worldview to make sense of, or this complex theoretical system to make sense of first.
Yeah, that's well grounded. That's a great example. But I think,
Right.
so, I think Musonius Rufus would say, you don't need, think about wealth. That's a great example. Pleasure, just think about the philosophies that promote pleasure as the end of life. Just think about the example of unhappy people who are unhappy despite their pleasurable experiences, or people you admire. Is what's written on their tombstone going to be, they had the most pleasure, or this guy really knew how to have fun? Or is there something else more valuable? And that sort of simplistic, really simple argument gets at, what's important in life. And perhaps you don't need to think so much about some of the more abstruse arguments about Epicureanism versus Stoicism, or hedonic utilitarianism versus, Kantianism, what have you. It's these sorts of things that get at the root of questions about, philosophies of life in this case.
Yeah, well put. So that's a good reminder for us, reminder for me at least. So that's that philosophical minimalism. And we're not throwing out philosophy, we're doing philosophy, but maybe it's a theoretical minimalism. That might be a better way of putting it. Maybe like an Occam's, I don't know if it's Occam's razor, but it's, use the fewest amount of words to get your point across. And it's probably going to be a better argument if you do. The next theme that came out is this, what I'm calling this complicated egalitarianism. So the last time we talked, Caleb, Musonius Rufus is often brought forward as this paradigm of Roman feminism because he argues that women should study philosophy. It's almost this kind of proto-feminism where he says, hey, you think women shouldn't be here, you think women shouldn't be listening to my lectures, but women have just as much to learn as you do, right? Like they're also concerned with living well. And that part is really, I think it's interesting. It's really historically interesting. It shows that kind of egalitarian tendency in the Stoics. We see that also in the cosmopolitanism, but we also get from him something more complicated. So men and women are equal in that sense, but once we get into our other roles, like we're equal as humans, but once we get into our other roles, our other ways of being, we're not equal. And so we're equal as humans, unequal in other respects. So in terms of that equality, here's a good quote from Musonius Rufus. He says, women have received from the gods the same reasoning power as men. Likewise, the same senses as the male. Likewise, too, each has the same parts of the body. In addition, a desire for virtue and an affinity for it belong by nature not only to men, but also to women. Since this is so, why would it be appropriate for men, but not women, to seek to live honorably and consider how to do so, which is what studying philosophy is? Is it appropriate for men to be good, but not women? That's a rhetorical question. So that's that example of that egalitarianism. But he almost does like this role. He makes this role ethic play where we're equal as humans, but now when we think of ourselves as women and men, we're not equal. And so he follows up here in a later passage. Perhaps someone says, what? Do you advise men to learn spinning along with women and women to pursue gymnastics along with men? Musonius says, I am not advising this, but I do say that since among humans the nature of males is stronger and of females is weaker, the most suitable tasks must be assigned to each nature, with the heavier ones being given to the strong and the lighter ones being given to the weaker. But sometimes when a health condition or circumstance requires it, or when opportunity allows it, some men could reasonably undertake some of the lighter tasks, and those which seem to be suited for women, and women in turn could perform some of the harder ones, and those which seem to be appropriate for men. And so what we get here is a kind of common sense account of gender roles. Gender roles exist because of natural physical differences between the sexes. It makes sense to enforce these as general heuristics or rules. And then it also makes sense to break these heuristics when they don't appropriately apply. When you have there's no reason to prevent a particularly strong or physically capable woman from becoming a police officer or a firefighter or something like this. It makes no sense to expect a physically weak man to perform physically strong tasks just because of their gender or their sex. And that being said, a core philosophical education is the same between both genders, he clarifies. So for both genders, we teach the difference between good and bad, helpful and harmful. We instill a shame towards everything base. We accustom everybody to hard work. We teach them not to fear death, and we teach them to be resilient to setbacks, misfortune, and failure. So that philosophical education is shared between humans, but then how you go about actually living as a man and a woman is actually quite different because of these natural inherent differences between us. And those shouldn't be ignored or shouldn't be considered, shouldn't be not considered or taken seriously. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's well put. I mean, first, the statement that women have received from God the same reasoning power as men, likewise, same senses as the male. I think that gets at the core of it for all people. The Stoics have this egalitarianism, at least all adults capable of reasoning, that because any adult is capable of reasoning, they belong to the same community in some sense. You know, there's this idea of kinship with every human because they are capable of thinking well, because they're capable of virtue. And that's no small thing, right? It's a fragment of the divine for Stoics, really, this ability to reason. So I think that is a central point Musonius Rufus is making here, and just draws out the logical conclusion from that, which is that everyone then should at some level study philosophy, where especially, he's not imagining everyone, going to the equivalent of a university and taking a history of philosophy courses. He's thinking about this practice of virtue. What does it take to be noble in one's behavior? That's what you should study. And that's what matters for everyone, and not merely the Roman, say, aristocrats he might be teaching. So I think that's just that's the fundamental point to pull out here.
Yeah, I think that's the first point, and I agree. Well summarized. I think there's that second point where there's this, and we'll see this as we get to the practical advice next. There's almost this conservatism to Musonius Rufus, which is probably a Roman conservatism, where when I say conservatism, I think there's this emphasis on what is natural. There's this emphasis on inherent differences, a kind of a natural hierarchy or natural capabilities. There's an emphasis on, instead of this idea that, the difference between men and women is a kind of a social construct, that there's no genuine difference, and so any sort of societal difference is a reflection of that social construct, and we can change that. It's this view instead that there are inherent differences. And so it's not even a progressive argument for why women should study philosophy. It's still like a naturalistic argument. It's like if you look at the nature of us, our nature as humans is the same. We both have access to reason. We both have access to the spark of the divine. And so we should both study philosophy. But I'm not saying women and men should exercise together, or they should be on the same, women should be part of the military, or men should stay at home and take care of the kids and women go out and do physical labor to make money. Those things are kind of not, that is a different role. That's a role, as Epictetus would say, it's one that's like subservient to your human role, to kind of your rational role. It's that specific role you find yourself in because of your body, and you find yourself in because of your natural inclinations and your natural skills. And those gender roles are there for a reason. They should be respected, or they should be deferred to. But also, then there's this but part. You should then make an exception if the body doesn't back this up. So if you have a particularly strong woman, if you have a particularly weak man, if you have a man that has a kind of inclination or skill set that tends to be female coded, or vice versa, you should allow movement between these. Basically, like there's a natural basis for these, but we should still have some flexibility, I think is the quick way of saying it.
I think that's definitely true. So perhaps you don't want to overuse the word minimal here, but sometimes some people will say, the Stoics were egalitarian, they're cosmopolitan, and they believed that, everyone was capable of reason. In some sense, they believe everyone has the same moral worth and same moral status. Therefore, they were pretty close to liberal people in our day and age. But I think of course, the ancient Stoics would not think, they would disagree that what many liberals think follows from equality, in fact, follows. Their equality really is a minimal picture in a way, although it's a fundamental to see every human as kin. They thought that was consistent with, of course, a hierarchy in the political sphere, in the home, not just between men and women, but between the different levels of family members, slaves in the household. And they didn't necessarily see that as inconsistent with their otherwise egalitarian type picture. So sometimes it does seem like people make too much hay out of Stoic egalitarianism, whereas I think perhaps that's a little too quick, which is I think is what you're getting at.
I'm just trying to paint this picture that's like, it's this kind of middle ground picture where on one view you have, this is an old Roman philosophy, and there's like, it's very traditionalist. It's not progressive. It's about, accept the society you find yourself in and don't do anything that's socially transgressive. Sometimes it gets presented that way. And then other times it gets presented, as you said, with this emphasis on cosmopolitanism, this emphasis on egalitarianism between all people. And it's more of a middle ground. And that comes into that idea of role ethics with Epictetus, which is that we are all equal qua humans. We are not equal as soldiers, as parents, as politicians, as business people, as physical laborers or workers. There's these kinds of there's inequalities in our other roles that have to do with either our physical capabilities, our natural talents, our sex, our gender, things like these. And it's this kind of common sense. I think it is almost this common sense middle ground. And there is still this element of being progressive, because he's saying we don't discard those heuristics. We don't discard the idea that men are typically better at this kind of work and women are typically better at that kind of work. But we are willing to break the rule if it doesn't apply in this situation. So yeah, closer to the middle than sometimes gets presented. Yeah,
I think so. And when you put it that way, it sounds totally reasonable.
It sounds, I think so. Hopefully I'm not steel manning it too hard, but it sounds like, yeah, we people tend to be inclined to certain types of things because of their talents and skills. But as he said here, right? I like this quote. But sometimes when a health condition or circumstance require it, or when opportunity allows it, some men could reasonably undertake some of the lighter tasks and those which seem to be suited for women, and women in turn could perform some of the harder ones and those which seem more appropriate for men. That seems, yeah, very reasonable. Great. So I'll move on to number 3. So that is that complicated egalitarianism. I don't know how complicated it is, but just this idea of we are equal as humans, but we're not totally equal. Inequalities exist, and we have to be conscious of those and aware of them. Otherwise, we're not living in accordance with nature. The last part I want to talk about, it's not really, the theme is controversial practical advice. It's not one argument. It's a series of things that Musonius Rufus argues for. I think some of them are funny. Some of them people are maybe controversial. I think because they don't all fall either politically in the modern sense, left or right. There's kind of this variety between them. And so I'd be interested if anybody endorses all of them, but it's interesting to see what he endorses, and it's valuable because I like to think of that idea of like, well, if I disagree with Musonius Rufus here, what part of Stoicism do I think he's getting wrong? Where do I think he's making a poor argument? And if I agree with him, do I think Stoicism supports that, or is just at that point just confirmation bias? I don't interrogate it because I agree with it. So I'll go through some of these and then I'll pull out some quotes for some of them, and feel free to stop me if you think any are worth discussing further. So one right off the bat, which is a strange one, is he says, well, not strange, but it's putting the money where the mouth is. He says a philosopher should never press charges for physical assault because they've not been harmed. And he makes this argument that, a philosopher who thinks it's right to forgive someone who offends him and acts accordingly is obviously better than someone who thinks he must defend himself by filing lawsuits or indictments. So you're really failing as a philosopher if you press charges. That's one argument. Another argument he makes, or another practical advice he gives, which is one I really like, is that physical labor as a type of job is excellent. It's a really good type of work for a philosopher to get into. He says, physical labor jobs, they provide abundant leisure for the soul to do some deep thinking and to reflect on the nature of education. Tasks that don't require excessive physical exertion don't prevent the soul from contemplating the better things and thus from becoming wiser than it was. If a person studies philosophy and farms at the same time, then I would not offer any other way of life to him. I think I like this because it's kind of pushing back against elitism here. So the educated man doesn't have to work in politics. The philosopher doesn't have to be, a successful businessman. If you're able to find a good physical job that gives you freedom of your mind to, in today's age, listen to podcasts, think about things you've reflected on, that's a good life. Because you've got that intellectual freedom. I think about, I used to work a job where a lot of it was like folding clothes. Like a lot of it was at a university. It was at my university, and I worked in the athletics, and there would be these just like large dryer units because my university people like rent out clothes. So you do the laundry and you just like fold the laundry from everybody leaving the gym. It was this job at the athletics facility. And I would just crush podcasts. And I like my work now, but I really value the intellectual freedom that came from that. He obviously says he says as well, if your work is too backbreaking, like if it's too difficult, then your mind goes into your body, your mind goes into the fatigue, and that's not good. You need a physical job that it's like not too hard, so you can think and reflect. He's talking about the one where your mind is free. So those are the first two. Another, only sexual relations in marriage for the sake of children are appropriate. So he's explicitly anti-adultery, anti-sex out of wedlock, and he's also explicitly anti-homosexuality. Calls out, same-sex relationships as being it's this appeal to temperance, right? It's like this pursuit of non-productive pleasure and the poor self-control, where instead you should be directing your sexual energy towards the productive, beneficial aspect of raising children in marriage. He also says that marriage is about uniting together for the sake of children. He claims here that abortion is wrong. It's not an ethical thing to do. And so there are some conservative things, but then he switches over to some things that I would say are less conservative. He says that it's permissible or even good to disobey your father if he orders you to do something wrong. So it's kind of anti-authority. A disobedient person is one who ignores or disobeys orders that are right, honorable, and beneficial, Musonius Rufus says. So it's not disobedient to refuse somebody in a position of power if they're asking you to steal, or they're asking you to do something that is unethical. I might stop there because I've got a couple more. Any comments on those first ones?
Yeah, it's a good set. I think the one about physical assault is pretty strange initially. Like, why would a philosopher not pursue? Really, it almost seems like upholding the law. But I think the last phrase from that lecture is illuminating and helpful. So he says, a philosopher is, after all, inconsistent if he says that a good man can never be wronged by a bad man, but then, while claiming to be a good man, charges that he is wronged by bad men. And I think what he's really getting at in that lecture is the Stoic attitude towards insult, whether it's verbal or physical, and that whether or not you press charges after an insult, because you could press charges because someone has harmed your reputation or something of that sort, it shouldn't be done because you believe you've been harmed. And that's the classic Stoic view. So if there is I think if you it's hard to read that as a universal ban. I think, not pressing charges for physical assault. It's perhaps a little bit more flexible, and perhaps also reason. You might say sometimes people use the word prima facie, or an initial reason not to press charges, unless you think there's some other overriding reason to perhaps enforce criminal justice, or if it's a serious assault, you might be protecting the community by pressing charges and such. But if you're taking that step, it's not done to save face, or because you were actually harmed in the assault. That's the Stoic view.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. There's pro-social reasons to enforce the law, and to stand up for yourself and other people that don't involve thinking your life was ruined by this event. This is from Stobaeus, who's reporting on what Musonius Rufus said. So you want to be, it's this thing when you're doing any sort of analysis where you want to be careful not to read it literally, but the line is, he said that he would never file a lawsuit against anyone for assault, nor would he advise anyone who thinks the study of philosophy is worthwhile to file one. But I think your point about doing that because you've been harmed is seeking vengeance, seeking retribution for harm is off the table. And I'm comfortable with that interpretation. That makes sense to me. It's consistent. This idea of never using the legal system, yeah, I think that's a bit far reaching. And maybe he's arguing for that, but if he is, I think maybe he's gone a bit too far.
I believe there's even some record suggesting he was involved in a lawsuit against another Roman. So
maybe he had a terrible time. Maybe he had a really bad experience with it and was like, I'm never doing that again. So I don't recommend anybody does that.
Yeah, that's funny. Perhaps so.
Any of those other ones you
certainly conservative about the view when it comes to marriage. The purpose for marriage is to have children. At the same time, he does say it's essential that the husband and wife are companions, and there's a specific virtue, for there are virtues associated with being a good husband or wife, related to what's often translated as companionship, which I think is useful. Yeah, so here's a line. In marriage, there must be, above all, companionship and care of husband and wife for each other, both in sickness and in health on every occasion. Each party entering into a marriage desires this, after all, just as they desire children. So that's interesting because it suggests maybe it's not the sole purpose of a marriage is to have children.
Yeah, I'm using the Cynthia King translations, page 57. He said that the chief end of marriage is uniting together and having children. Husband and wife should come together for the following reasons: to live with each other, to have children, and to consider all things as common possessions and nothing as private, not even the body itself. The birth of the child, which this union will bring about, is important, but this cannot be the only motive for marriage, since procreation could result from sexual relations apart from marriage, just as when animals mate. So I think that's the point you're getting to, which is, if the only point was having kids, everybody could just go have kids. The important point is that you're in a kind of a bond, a companionship, and then having kids in that context.
I think so. But as your passage reveals, you can't perhaps read him in the more liberal way, which is, or, sort of like there are different purposes to marriage, companionship, or whether or not you want to have children. So that liberal reading probably just doesn't work.
Yeah. But also we shouldn't have bad marriages for the point of, you shouldn't be terrible to your wife, but be together because you got to have kids.
Absolutely. I think it's also, in terms of the list, it's also worth calling out the view about parental authority. That's probably another place in which Musonius Rufus is at least slightly subversive, just because parental authority, especially the authority of the father in Roman society, was immense. I think in earlier Roman times, father ruled his household completely. He had a say over who lived and died in the household. So suggestions like Musonius Rufus's were perhaps, by the time he was around, those views had likely laxed a little, but still somewhat subversive in terms of what the authority of your parents are, especially the father.
Yeah, and I wonder even how, it's easy to put our own kind of contemporary view onto this. I wonder how subversive even just saying don't have, he says that don't sleep with your female slaves. Like in one sense, I associate it with I associate that with kind of Christianity and kind of modern political conservatism. But I wonder if that would be, I don't know, it's subversive, but it's like calling out kind of people's behavior. Like there's probably a lot of powerful, successful, popular people who are going about not being monogamous in their marriage. So there is a critical aspect to that. It's punching up as well as telling, it's providing a consistent standard for everybody, not trying to get the deviants in line, by way to read it.
Well, I do think there are some people who, they're just sort of this is maybe getting a little far afield, but there's these sort of historical arguments about Christianity playing an essential role in changing the makeup of Western culture because of perhaps some kinds of Christian egalitarianism being less focused on the family as such. But I do know some people have argued you see that a little earlier in the Romans, especially some aristocratic Romans, and the Stoics are a good candidate for that. And I think this is an example of that precisely. Even though because Romans could do whatever they wanted with their slaves, and so Musonius Rufus is saying, even though you can do that, you shouldn't. And you should think, in a real sense, think worse of people who do mistreat their slaves or can't control their sexual appetites. And but I think that does sort of show the precursor of Christianity in terms of more egalitarianism towards slaves, women, and of course, there's a general point about everyone having a soul, and that you see in Stoicism. That is that fundamental point of kinship with the rest of humanity, equality, at least as humans go. So that takes it a little far afield, but I do think that's an interesting thought and worth perhaps writing or thinking about some more.
Well put. It's really interesting. I like that idea of the soul. Because, the Stoics don't equate, I wouldn't want to say the capacity for reason is the soul for the Stoics. That's a bit of an oversimplification of the way they view that. But it is the thing that makes us special, sets us apart, and we all have in common, men and women, as we just spoke to. Interesting idea. Cool. So those are some of his advice, some of his practical advice. He has some more. In the later end of the book, it becomes focused on. We talked about in the last episode. He doesn't quite become an ascetic. He's not. Virtue is not developed solely through physical practice, but he thinks there's a value to physical practice and a value to physical hardship and training, and some advice related to that. So first, he says diet is very important for a good life. It really matters what we eat. He specifically recommends a raw food diet of whole food. Take that for what it's worth, but that's what Musonius Rufus wants you to eat. We eat fancy foods for pleasure, which is bad. There's no need for this. There's no need for this pleasure. And then the wrong kind of food can reduce our mental acuity. That's just the idea of kind of overeating or eating poorly means we're less mentally sharp, less able to reflect and do philosophy well. Another piece of advice is that we should dress minimalistically. He says we want to develop calluses. We want to strengthen our body without harming it. So you think of this, not wearing shoes. We want to feel some heat and cold. Again, not too much. You think about this idea of as much as you can, such that you don't become distracted by it. If you're so cold you can't think well, that's not good. But you want to be the kind of person that can, go outside in the cold and not have it entirely distract you or ruin you. Same thing with heat. We want to be able to sweat a little bit, but not too much. But more than the average person was aiming for at his time. Otherwise, he wouldn't be giving that advice. And probably a lot more than we feel today with our air conditioning and, our heaters. Another is to avoid luxurious living. So he says, quote, I myself would therefore choose to be sick rather than live in luxury. Being sick harms the body only. Living in luxury harms both soul and body by making the body weak and powerless, and the soul undisciplined and cowardly. And so there's this idea of this corrupting aspect of luxury. Physical hardship harms the body, but too much luxury harms the body and the soul, makes your body weak and your soul weak. And then the last piece of advice, he says you should grow out your hair. I just like calling out, we sometimes skip over these things. I just like focusing on them. And there it's again this kind of natural argument about why are you trimming your hair? Just leave it alone. Because if it gets in the way of your movement, if you get stuck on things, then cut it. But don't trim it. Just leave it alone. And it's this, I think again, this focus on this kind of natural living. It's not quite this Diogenes the cynic approach to things, but we probably shouldn't be stressing about our haircuts and making sure we've got, just the right outfits. We're just the right temperature. We're eating the fanciest food. This has a real kind of has a real potential corrupting influence.
Yeah, some of the stuff about not trimming your hair is too funny. He would certainly look down on us, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that stuff is good to call out, right? Because sometimes people say, where is the Stoic practical advice? And here it is. It's this entire lecture about cutting hair. Man should cut his hair the way he prunes vines by removing only the stuff that gets in the way.
Nice. It does seem like sometimes there are social purposes that I wonder if are being overlooked by this line of thought to by Musonius Rufus. But he's certainly right when it comes to people can focus too much attention on this, and regardless of whether there are social purposes or not to being well groomed, there's certainly a risk whenever you're engaged in this kind of practice. And I think wealth is probably the clearest example where you can see it, and that line about wealth is really nice. But even if you think, oh, I ought to be well groomed because that's the culture of my society, and Musonius Rufus also tells me I need to be married and I need to look presentable to get married. So maybe that reasoning is fine as far as it goes, but there's certainly risks involved with it as well.
Yeah, well, here, he says men who cut, we're digging deep into the hair. Men who cut their hair clearly do so in order to look beautiful to those whom they wish to please. They trim and arrange their hair to attract the attention of women and boys whose praise they seek. Other men cut their hair because it bothers them, and they shave their beards. Clearly, such men have been broken by luxurious living and have become completely emasculated. So there's a point there, right? Like the hair stuff is funny, but the point is, I think about this a lot in the way that I dress. I'll ground it in a practical example. I'm not a very fashionable guy. I don't have like a lot of, and a lot of the reason I struggled with fashion is I thought like, man, I'm not going to buy that $100 shirt just to like impress people. I'm not going to it just seemed wrong to me to like go to the mall and stress about the outfits you're going to wear just so you can physically appear a certain way. That's not the same as like grooming and basic hygiene, but I had a hard time kind of wrapping my head around fashion for that reason. And I think this is part of his point. It's like, if you're really doing this to like, because you're addicted to other people thinking you're attractive or praising the way you look, there's a problem there. And then likewise, if you're physically uncomfortable with a beard, you're just kind of being physically weak. You should be able to put up with the itching and the scratching and the uncomfortableness. Do I think this is the thing you should be thinking about as a philosopher? No, but it encapsulates that kind of idea of, don't take extra steps or do this extra work for your ego and your pride. And if you're taking these extra steps because you can't handle a little bit of discomfort, then you've probably become a bit too weak with physical discomfort. And
yeah, that's certainly a theme you get through Musonius Rufus. And you see positive examples of Spartans that are throughout the lectures, especially their ability to withstand physical pain, of course, but Musonius Rufus and that bit about not assault, that's being able to withstand, not suing people in response to physical or verbal assaults. That's being able to withstand social pain, not crave after pleasures, and focus ultimately on philosophy, which he sees as practice. So he's certainly consistent throughout.
Great. Anything else on Musonius?
I think that's it. I think it's always good to revisit Musonius Rufus. Perhaps something we could do in another year or so. We do have a course on Musonius Rufus in the Stoa app where we go through these different lectures and connect exercises for each one. So do check that out if you haven't already. But I think this is a good practice, and thanks for putting this together.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb.